Chapter 41. Old Friends. There was a thumping knock at the door, and Glocta jerked his head up, left eye suddenly twitching. Who the hell comes knocking at this hour? Frost? Severard? Or someone else? Superior Goyle, maybe, come to pay me a visit with his circus freaks? Might the Arch-Lector have grown tired of his toy cripple already? One could hardly say the feast went according to plan, and His Eminence is hardly the forgiving type. Body found floating by the docks. The knocking came again, loud, confident knocking, the kind that demands the door be opened before it's broken down. "I'm coming!" he shouted, voice cracking slightly as he prized himself out from behind his table, legs wobbly. "I'm just coming!" He snatched up his cane and limped to the front door, took a deep breath and fumbled with the latch. It was not Frost or Severard, nor was it Goyle or one of his freakish practicals. It was someone much more unexpected. Glocta raised an eyebrow, then leaned against the doorframe. "Major West, what a surprise." Sometimes, when old friends meet, things are instantly as they were all those years before. The friendship resumes, untouched, as though there had been no interruption. Sometimes, but not now. "Inquisitor Glocta," mumbled West, hesitant, awkward, embarrassed. "I'm sorry to bother you so late." "Don't mention it," said Glocta with icy formality. The Major nearly winced. "May I come in?" "Of course." Glocta shut the front door behind him, then limped after West into his dining room. The Major squeezed himself into one of the chairs, and Glocta took another. They sat there, facing each other for a moment without speaking. What the hell does he want, at this hour or any other? Glocta scrutinized his old friend's face in the glow from the fire and the one flickering candle. Now that he could see him more clearly, he realized West had changed. He looks old. His hair was thinning at the temples, going grey round his ears. His face was pale, pinched, slightly hollow. He looks worried, ground down, close to the edge. West looked round at the mean room, the mean fire, the mean furniture, cautiously up at Glocta, then quickly down at the floor. Nervous, as if he had something picking at his mind. He looks ill at ease, as well he might. He did not seem ready to break the silence, so Glocta did it for him. "So, how long hath it been, eh? Apart from that night in town, and we can hardly count that, can we?" The memory of that unfortunate meeting hung between them for a moment like a fart, then West cleared his throat. 9 years. 9 years. Imagine that. Since we stood on the ridge, old friends together, looking down toward the river, down toward the bridge and all those Gurkish on the other side. Seems a lifetime ago, doesn't it? 9 years. I can remember you pleading with me not to go down there, but I was having none of it. What a fool I was, eh? Thought I was our only hope. Thought I was invincible. You saved us all that day. Saved the whole army. Did I? How wonderful. I dare say if I died on that bridge, there'd be statues of me all over the place. Shame I didn't, really. Shame for everyone. West winced and shifted in his chair, looking ever more uncomfortable. "I looked for you afterwards," he mumbled. "You looked for me? How hugely fucking noble. What a true friend. Precious little good it did me. Dragged off in agony with my leg hacked to mincemeat, and that was just the beginning." "You did not come to discuss old times, West?" No, I didn't. I came about my sister." Glocta paused. He had certainly not expected that answer. "Adi?" "Adi, yes. I'm leaving for Angland soon, and I was hoping that perhaps you could keep an eye on her for me while I'm away." West's eyes flickered up nervously. "You always had a way with women, Sand." Glocta grimaced at the sound of his first name. No one called him that anymore. No one besides my mother. "You always knew just what to say. Do you remember those 3 sisters? What were their names? You had them all eating out of your hand." West smiled, but Glocta couldn't. He remembered, but the memories were weak now, colorless, faded. The memories of another man, a dead man. My life began in Gurkul, in the Emperor's prisons. The memories since then are much more real. Stretched out in bed like a corpse after I came back, in the darkness, waiting for friends who never came. He looked at West, and he knew that his glance was terribly cold. "Do you think to win me with your honest face and your talk of old times, like a long-lost dog at last come faithfully home? I know better. You stink, West. You smell like betrayal. That memory at least is mine." Glocta leaned back slowly in his chair. "Sand Dan Glocta," he murmured, as though recalling a name he once knew. "Whatever became of him, eh, West? You know, that friend of yours, that dashing young man, handsome, proud, fearless, magic touch with the women, loved and respected by all, destined for great things. Wherever did he go?" West looked back, puzzled and unsure of himself, and said nothing. Glocta lurched towards him, hands spread out on the table, lips curling back to show his ruined mouth. "Dead. He died on the bridge. And what remains? A fucking ruin with his name. A limping, skulking shadow. A crippled ghost clinging to life the way the smell of piss clings to a beggar. He has no friends, this loathsome fucking remnant, and he wants none. Get you gone, West. Go back to Varuz and to Luthar and the rest of those empty bastards. There's no one here you know." Glocta's lips trembled and spat with revulsion. He wasn't sure who disgusted him more, West or himself. The Major blinked, his jaw muscles working silently. He got shakily to his feet. "I'm sorry," he said over his shoulder. "Tell me!" shouted Glocta, bringing him up short of the door. "The rest of them. They stuck to me so long as I was useful, so long as I was going up. I always knew it. I wasn't so very surprised they wanted nothing to do with me when I came back. But you, West, I always thought you were a better friend than that, a better man. I always thought that you at least, you alone, would come to visit me." He shrugged. "I suppose I was wrong." Glocta turned away, frowning towards the fire, waiting for the sound of the front door closing. "She didn't tell you?" Glocta looked back. "Who?" "Your mother." He snorted. "My mother? Tell me what?" "I did come. Twice. As soon as I learned that you were back, I came. Your mother turned me away at the gates of your estate. She said that you were too ill to take visitors, and that in any case she wanted nothing more to do with the army, and nothing more to do with me in particular. I came back again a few months later. I thought I owed you that much. That time a servant came to see me off. Later I heard that you had joined the Inquisition and left for Angland. I put you out of my mind, until we met that night in the city." West trailed off. It took a while for his words to sink in, and by the time they had, Glocta realized that his mouth was hanging open. So simple. No conspiracy, no web of betrayal. He almost wanted to laugh at the stupidity of it. My mother turned him away at the gate, and I never thought to doubt that no one came. She always hated West, a most unsuitable friend, far beneath her precious son. No doubt she blamed him for what happened to me. I should have guessed, but I was too busy wallowing in pain and bitterness, too busy being tragic. He swallowed. You came? West shrugged. For what it's worth. Well, what can we do except try to do better? Glockter blinked and took a deep breath. I'm sorry. Forget what I said, if you can. Please, sit down. You were saying something about your sister. Yes, my sister. West fumbled his way back to his seat, looking down at the floor, his face taking on that worried, guilty look again. We're leaving for Angland soon, and I don't know when I'll be back. Or if, I suppose. She'll be without any friends in the city, and, well, I think you met her once when you came to our house. Of course, and a good deal more recently than that, in fact. You did? Yes, with our mutual friend Captain Luthar. West turned even paler. There is something more to this than he is telling me. But Glockter did not feel like putting his clubfoot through his one friendship quite yet, not so soon after it had been reborn. He stayed quiet, and after a moment the Major went on. Life has been difficult for her. I could have done something. I should have done something. He stared miserably down at the table, and an ugly spasm ran across his face. I know that one of my own favorites. Self-loathing. But I chose to let other things get in the way, and I did my best to forget all about it, and I pretended that everything was fine. She has suffered, and I am to blame. He coughed, then swallowed awkwardly. His lip began to tremble, and he covered his face with his hands. My fault. If something were to happen to her... His shoulders shook silently, and Glockter raised his eyebrows. He was used to men crying in his presence, of course, but I usually have at least to show them the instruments first. Come on, Colum. This isn't like you. He reached slowly across the table, half pulled his hand back, and then patted his sobbing friend awkwardly on the shoulder. You've made some mistakes. But haven't we all? They're in the past and can't be changed. There's nothing to be done now except to do better, eh? What? Can it really be me talking? Inquisitor Glockter, comforter of the needy? But West seemed reassured. He lifted his head, wiped his runny nose, stared up hopefully at Glockter with wet eyes. You're right. You're right, of course. I have to make amends. Have to. Will you help me, son? Will you look after her while I'm gone? I'll do whatever I can for her, Colin. You can depend on me. I was once proud to call you my friend, and I would be again. Strange, but Glockter could almost feel a tear in his own eye. Can it be? Inquisitor Glockter, trustworthy friend, Inquisitor Glockter, protector of vulnerable young women? He almost laughed out loud at the idea, and yet here he was. He never would have thought that he needed one, but it felt good to have a friend again. Hollit, said Glockter. What? Those three sisters. Their name was Hollit. He chuckled to himself, the memory filtering through a little clearer than before. They had a thing about fencing. Loved it. Something about the sweat, maybe. I think that was when I decided to take it up. West laughed, then screwed up his face as if he was trying to remember something. What was our quartermaster's name? He had a thing for the youngest one, was out of his mind with jealousy. What the hell was that man's name? Fat Man. The name was not so very difficult for Glockter to recall. Ruth. Salem Ruth. Ruse, that's the one. I'd forgotten all about him. Ruse. He could tell a story like no one else, that man. We'd sit up all night listening to him, all of us rolling with laughter. Whatever became of him? Glockter paused for a moment. I think he left the army to become a merchant of some sort. He waved his hand dismissively. I heard he moved north. Chapter 42. Back to the mud. Carleon weren't at all how the dogman remembered it, but then he tended to remember it burning. A memory like that stays with you. Roofs falling in, windows cracking, crowds of fighters everywhere, all drunk on pain and winning and, well, drink. Looting, killing, setting fires, all the unpleasant rest of it. Women screaming, men shouting, stinking with smoke and fear. In short, a sack with him and Logan at the heart of it. Bethod had put the fires out and made it his, moved in, then started building. He hadn't got far when he kicked Logan and the dogman and the rest of them into exile, but they must have been building every day since. It was twice as big now as it used to be, even before it got burned, covering the whole hill and all the slope down to the river. Bigger than Ulfric, bigger than any city the dogman had seen. From where he was, up in the trees on the other side of the valley, you couldn't see the people, but there had to be an awful lot of them in there. 3 new roads leading out from the gates, 2 big new bridges, new buildings everywhere, and big ones where the small ones used to be. Lots of them, built from stone mostly, slate roofs, glass in some of the windows even. They've been busy, said Three Trees. New walls, said Grim. Lots of them, muttered the dogman. There were walls all over. There was a big one round the outside, with proper towers and everything, and a big ditch beyond it. There was even a bigger one round the top of the hill where Scarling's Hall used to stand. Huge great thing. Dogman could hardly work out where they got all the stone for the building of it. Biggest damn wall I ever saw, he said. Three Trees shook his head. I don't like it. If Fawley gets took, we won't never get him out. If Fawley gets took, there'll be 5 of us, Chief, and we'll be looked for. He's no threat to no one, but we are. Getting him out will be the least of our worries. He'll muddle through like always. Most likely he'll outlive the lot of us. Wouldn't surprise me, muttered Three Trees. We're in a dangerous line of work. They slithered back through the brush, back to the camp. Black Dow was there, looking even worse-tempered than usual. Talduru, too, working at a hole in his coat with a needle, face all screwed up as his great thick fingers fumbled with the little splinter of metal. Fawley was sat near him, looking up at the sky through the leaves. How you feeling, Fawley? Asked the dogman. Bad, but you gotta have fear to have courage. Dogman grinned at him. So I heard. Reckon we're both heroes then, eh? Must be, he said, grinning back. Three Trees was all business. You sure about this, Fawley? Sure you want to go in there? Once you get in, there might be no getting out, no matter how good a talker you are. I'm sure. I may be shitting myself, but I'm going. I can do more good there than I can out here. Someone's got to warn them about the Shanker. You know it, Chief. Who else is there? The old boy nodded to himself, slow as the sun rising, taking his moment, as always. Aye. All right. Tell him I'm waiting here by the old bridge. Tell him I'm alone, just in case Bethod decides you're not welcome, you understand? I get it. You're on your own, Three Trees. It was just the 2 of us made it back over the mountains. They'd all gathered now, and Fawley smiled round at them. Well then, lads, it's been something, hasn't it? Shut up, weakest, scowled Dow. Bethod ain't got nothing against you. You're coming back. In case I don't know, it's been something. The dogman nodded to him, awkward. It was the same dirty, scarred-up faces as usual, but grimmer than ever. None of them liked letting one of their own put himself in danger. But Fawley was right. Someone had to do it, and he was the best suited. Sometimes weakness is a better shield than strength, the dogman reckoned. Bethod was an evil bastard, but he was a clever one. The Shanker were coming, and he needed the warning. Hopefully, he'd be grateful for it. They walked together down to the edge of the trees, looking out towards the path. It crossed over the old bridge and wound down into the valley. From there to the gates of Kalia, into Bethod's fortress. Forley took a deep breath, and the dogman clapped him on his shoulder. "Luck, Forley. Good luck." "And to you." He squeezed Dogman's hand in his for a minute. "To all of you lads, eh?" And he turned and marched off towards the bridge, with his head up high. "Luck, Forley!" shouted Blackdow, startling them all. He turned round for a minute, the weakest, stood on top of the bridge, and he grinned. Then he was gone. Three Trees took a deep breath. "Weapons," he said, "just in case Bethod don't want to hear sense. And wait for the signal, eh?" It seemed a long time waiting, up in the leaves, staying quiet and still, looking down at all them new walls. The dogman lay on his belly, bow near at hand, watching, waiting, wondering how Forley was doing in there. A long, tense time. Then he saw them. Horsemen coming out the nearest gate, riding over one of the new bridges, crossing the river. They'd got a cart at the back. Dogman wasn't sure why they'd have a cart, but he didn't like it any. No sign of Forley, and he wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad. They came quick, spurring up the side of the valley, up the steep path towards the trees and the stream and the old stone bridge across it, right at the dogman. He could hear the hooves thumping on the dirt, close enough to count now and take a good look at. Spears, shields, and good armor, helmets and mail, 10 of them, and 2 others sitting on the cart either side of the driver, carrying some sorts of things that looked like little bows on blocks of wood. He didn't know what they were about, and he didn't like not knowing. He was the one wanted to be giving them the surprises. He wriggled back through the brush on his stomach, sloshed through the stream, and hurried to the edge of the trees, where he could get a good view of the old bridge. 3 Trees, Tull, and Dow were standing round the near side of it, and he waved over to them. Couldn't see Grim. He must have been off in the woods away beyond. He made the sign for horsemen, held up his fist to say 10, hand flat on his chest to say armor. Dow took up his sword and axe, ran up into a bunch of broken rocks high up beside the bridge, keeping low and quiet. Tull slid down the bank into the stream, luckily no more than knee-deep right then, plastered his big self against the far side of the arch with his great long sword held up above the water. Made the dogman a bit nervous. He could see Tull so clear from where he was sitting. Still, the riders wouldn't see him at all if they came straight up the path. They'd only be expecting one man alone, and Dogman hoped they wouldn't come too careful. He hoped, because if they took the time to check, it'd be a fucking disaster. He watched 3 Trees strap his shield on his arm, draw his sword, stretch his neck out. Then he just stood, waiting, big and solid, blocking the path on the near side of the bridge, seeming all alone in the world. The dogman could hear the hoofbeats loud now, and the clattering of the cart's wheels out beyond the trees. He pulled out a few arrows and planted them in the earth, point down, where he could get to them quick, doing his best to swallow his fear. His fingers were shaking all the while, but that didn't matter. They'd work all right when they needed to. "Wait for the signal," he whispered to himself. "Wait for the signal." He knocked a shaft to his bow and half drew the string, taking aim down towards the bridge. Damn it, but he needed to piss bad. The first spear point showed itself over the crest of the hill, then others. Bobbing helmets, mailed chests, horses' faces. Bit by bit, the riders came up towards the bridge. The cart rolled behind, with its driver and its 2 funny passengers, pulled by a big, shaggy cart horse. The rider up front saw 3 Trees now, waiting for him over the hump of the bridge, and he spurred on forward. The dogman breathed a little easier as the others trotted after him in a clump, all eagerness. Forley must have said as he was told, they were expecting only one. Dogman could see Tull peering up from underneath the mossy arch as the horses clopped above him. By the dead, his hands were shaking. He was worried he'd let the arrow fly half-drawn and ruin the whole thing. The cart stopped on the far bank. The two men on it stood up and pointed their strange bows at Three Trees. The Dogman got himself a nice aim on one of them and drew the string back all the way. Most of the riders were on the bridge by now, horses shying and stirring about, unhappy at being packed in so tight. The one at the front reined up in front of Three Trees, spear pointing at him. The old boy didn't back away a step, though. Not him. He just frowned up, not giving the riders any room to get around him, keeping them choked up on the bridge. "Wow, wow," the Dogman heard their leader saying. "Rud Three Trees. We thought you was long dead, old man." He knew the voice, one of Bethod's Carls from way back. Bad Enough, they called him. "Reckon I've got a fight or two left in me," said Three Trees, still giving no ground. Bad Enough took a look about him, squinting into the trees, sense enough to see he was in a poor position, but not too careful. "Where's the rest of you? Where's that fucker Dow, eh?" Three Trees shrugged. "It's just me." "Back to the mud, eh?" The Dogman could just see Bad Enough grinning under his helmet. "Shame. Hoped I'd be the one to kill that dirty bastard." Dogman winced, half expecting Dow to come flying out of those rocks right then, but there was no sign of him. Not yet. Waiting for the signal for once. "Where's Bethod?" asked Three Trees. "The king don't come out for the likes of you. Anyhow, he's off in England, kicking the Union's arses. Prince Calder's taking care of things while he's gone." Three Trees snorted. "Prince, is it now? I remember him sucking on his mother's tit. He could scarcely do that right." "A lot's changed, old man. All kinds of things." By the dead, Dogman was wishing they'd get on with it one way or another. He could hardly keep the piss in. "Wait for the signal," he was mouthing to himself, just to try and keep his hands steady. "The flatheads are everywhere," Three Trees was saying. "They'll be coming south by next summer. Sooner, maybe. Something needs doing. Why don't you come with us, eh? You can warn Calder yourself. We bought a cart for you to ride in. Out of your age shouldn't have to walk." A couple of the other riders laughed at that, but Three Trees didn't join them. "Where's Fawley?" he growled. "Where's the weakest?" There was more sniggering from the horsemen. "Oh, he's nearby," said Bad Enough. "He's real close. Why don't you get in the cart and we'll take you right to him, and we can all sit round and talk about flatheads nice and peaceful." The Dogman didn't like this, not at all. He'd got a nasty feeling. "You must take me for some new kind of fool," said Three Trees. "I'm going nowhere till I've seen Fawley." Bad Enough frowned at that. "You're in no state to be telling us what you'll do. You might have been the big man once, but you're come to less than nothing, and that's a fact. Now give up your blade and get in the fucking cart like I told you before I lose my temper." He tried to nudge his horse forward again, but Three Trees wasn't budging. "Where's Fawley?" he growled. "And I'll have a straight answer or I'll have your guts." Bad Enough grinned over his shoulder at his mates, and they grinned back. "All right, old man, since you're asking. Calder wanted us to wait for this, but I've got to see the look on your face. The weakest's in the cart. Leastways, most of 'em is." He smiled and let something drop from his saddle. A canvas sack with something in it. Dogman could guess already what it was. It hit the ground near Three Trees' feet. The something rolled out, and the Dogman could see on the old boy's face that he'd guessed right. Fawley's head. Well, that was it, of course. Fuck the signal. Dogman's first arrow stuck one of the men on the cart right through his chest, and he screamed and tumbled over into the back, dragging the driver with him. It was a good shot, but there was no time to think on that. He was far too busy fumbling for another arrow and shouting. Didn't even know what he was shouting, just that he was. Grim must have been shooting as well. One of the Carls on the bridge gave a yell, fell off his horse and splashed into the stream. Three Trees was down in a crouch, hiding behind his shield, backing off while Bad Enough prodded at him with his spear, kicking his horse off the bridge and onto the path on our side. The rider behind pushed around the side of him, keen to get off the bridge, coming close beside the rocks. "Fuck you bastards!" Dow flew out of the stones above him, barreled into the rider. They tumbled down together, a mess of limbs and weapons, but the dogman could see that Dow was on top. His axe went up and down a couple of times, quick, one less to worry on. Dogman's second arrow went well wide of the mark. He was so busy shouting his head off, but it stuck one of the horses in the rump, and that turned out better than anything. It started rearing and thrashing about, and soon all the horses were milling and crying while their riders cursed and bumbled around, spears going every which way, noise and mess on all sides. The horseman at the back split in half all of a sudden, blood spraying everywhere. The thunderhead had come up from the stream, got round behind them. There's no armour that could stop a blow like that. The giant roared and swung the great length of bloody metal over his head again. The next in line got his shield up in time, but he might as well not have bothered. The blade hacked a big chunk out of it, tore his head open, and hammered him out of the saddle. The blow was that strong it clubbed the horse down too. One of them had got his mount turned now, bringing up his spear to stab at Tull from the side. Before he could, he grunted and jerked, arching his back. Dogman could see the feathers sticking from his side. Grim must have shot him, and he tumbled down. His foot caught in the stirrup, and he hung there, swinging. He was groaning and moaning and trying to right himself, but his horse was plunging now along with the others, making him dance, wrong way up, smacking his head against the side of the bridge. He dropped his spear in the stream, tried to pull himself up, then his horse half landed a kick on his shoulder and knocked him free. He went down under the milling hooves, and the dogman paid him no more mind. The second archer was still sitting up on the cart. He was getting over his shock now, and lining up his funny bow on 3 trees, still squatting down behind his shield. Dogman shot at him, but he was hurrying and yelling, and his shaft missed, and he hit the driver beside him in his shoulder, just got up from the back of the cart, knocked him back down again. The weird bow twanged, and 3 trees jerked back from his shield. The dogman was worried for a minute, then he saw that the arrow split the heavy wood and punched on through, but stopped just short of catching 3 trees in the face. It was lodged there through his shield, feathers sticking out one side, point out the other. That's an evil little bow, Dogman thought. He heard Tull roar and saw another rider fly off into the stream. Another dropped with one of Grim's arrows in his back. Dow turned and chopped the back legs out from under Bad Enough's horse with his sword, and it stumbled and slid, pitching him off onto the ground. The last couple were trapped. Dow and 3 trees at one end of the bridge, Tull at the other, too tight with frightened, riderless horses for them to turn around or nothing, at the mercy of Grim out in the woods. He wasn't in a merciful mood, it seemed, and it didn't take him long to pick 'em off. The one with the bow tried to make a break for it, chucking his bit of wood away and jumping down from the cart. Dogman thought nice and careful about his aiming this time, and his shaft got the archer right between the shoulders and knocked him on his face before he could get more than a few paces. He had a go at crawling, but he wasn't crawling far. The driver of the cart showed his face again, groaning and grabbing at the arrow in his shoulder. The dogman didn't usually kill men that were down, but he reckoned today was an exception. His arrow got the driver through the mouth, and that was him dealt with. Dogman could see one of the riders limping away, one of Grim's arrows in his leg, and lined him up with his last shaft. 3 trees got there first, though, and stuck him through the back with his sword. There was another one still moving, struggling up to his knees, and the dogman took an aim on him. Before he could loose, Dow stepped up and hacked his head off, blood everywhere. Horses still milling, screaming, slipping on the slick stones of the bridge. Dogman could see Bad Enough now, the last one going. He must have lost his helmet when he fell off his horse. He was struggling in the stream on his hands and knees, slowed up by all that weight of mail. He'd dropped his shield and his spear to make better time running for it, but he hadn't realized he was coming right at the dogman. "Get him alive!" shouted 3 trees. Tull set off down one bank, but he was making slow progress, slipping and sliding in the mud the cart churned up. "Get him alive!" Dow was after him too, splashing and cursing in the water. Bad Enough was close now. The dogman could hear his scared gasping as he struggled down the stream. "Ah!" he howled as Dogman's arrow thudded into his leg just below the bottom of his mailcoat. He toppled sideways onto the bank, blood leaking into the muddy water. He started dragging himself up the wet turf beside the stream. "That's it, Dogman!" shouted Three Trees. "Alive!" The Dogman slid out the trees and down the bank through the water. He pulled his knife out. Tull and Dow were still a little ways off, hurrying towards him. Bad Enough rolled over in the mud, his face screwed up with the pain of the arrow in his leg. He held his hands up. All right, I'll go." "You what?" asked the Dogman, looking down at him. He said again, looking mightily surprised, hand gripped to his neck. There was blood pouring out between his fingers, down the front of his wet mail. Dow splashed up beside them and stood there looking down. "Well, that's the end of that," he said. "What you do that for?" shouted Three Trees, hurrying over. "Hey?" asked the Dogman. Then he looked down at his knife. It was all bloody. Oh. That's when he saw it was him as had cut Bad Enough's throat. "We could have asked him questions," said Three Trees. "He could have took a message back to Calder, told him who did this and why." "Wake up, Chief," muttered Tull Duru, already wiping his sword down. "No one cares a shit for the old ways no more. Besides, they'll be after us soon enough. No point letting them know more than we have to." Dow clapped the Dogman on the shoulder. "You were right to do it. This bastard's head'll do for a message." Dogman wasn't sure Dow's approval was something he was after, but it was a bit late now. It took Dow a couple of chops to get Bad Enough's head off. He carried it, swinging by its hair, with as little care or worry as he'd carry a bag of turnips. He grabbed a spear out of the stream on his way, found a spot he liked. "Things ain't the way they used to be," Three Trees was muttering as he strode off down the bank towards the bridge, where Grim was already picking over the bodies. The Dogman followed him, watching Dow stick Bad Enough's head on the spear, shoving the blunt end into the ground, stepping back, hands on hips, to admire his work. He shifted it a bit to the right, then back to the left, until he'd got it nice and straight. He grinned over at the Dogman. "Perfect," he said. "What now, Chief?" Tull was asking. "What now?" Three Trees was stooping down on the bank, washing his bloody hands in the river. "What do we do?" asked Dow. The old boy stood up slowly, wiped his hands on his coat, taking his time, thinking on it. "South. We're very Fawley on the way. We take these horses here, since they'll be coming after us now, and we head south. Tull, you better unhitch that cart horse. He's the only one as'll carry you." "South?" asked the Thunderhead, looking confused. "South to where?" "Angland." "Angland?" asked the Dogman, and he could tell they were all thinking it. "For what? Ain't they fighting down there?" "Course they are. That's why I've a mind to go." Dow frowned. "Us? What have we got against the Union?" "No, fool," said Three Trees. "I've a mind to fight along with them." "With the Union?" asked Tull, his lip curling up. "With those bloody women? That ain't our fight, Chief." "Any fight against Bethod is my fight now. I mean to see the end of him." Once he'd thought on it, the Dogman had never yet seen Three Trees change his mind. Never once. "Who's with me?" he asked. They all were, of course. It was raining, thin rain making the whole world damp. Soft as a maiden's kiss, as they say, though the Dogman could hardly remember what one of those felt like. Rain seemed right somehow for the occasion. Dow was done with piling the dirt, and he sniffed and dug the spade down into the earth beside the grave. It was a long way from the road, a good long way. They didn't want no one finding it and digging Fawley up. They all gathered round, just 5 now, looking down. It was a long time since they'd had anyone to bury among them. The Shanker got Logan, of course, not too long ago, but they never had found the body. There might have been just one less in the band, but it seemed to the Dogman like there was a lot missing. Three Trees frowned, taking a moment, thinking out what to say. It was just as well he was the chief and had to find the words, because Dogman didn't reckon he could have found a thing. After a minute, Three Trees started speaking, slow as the light fading at sunset. This was a weak man here. The weakest, that's a fact. That was his name, and ain't that a joke? To call a man the weakest. The worst fighter they could find to surrender to Nine Fingers. Weak fighter, no doubt, but strong heart, say I. Aye, said Grim. Strong heart, said Talduru. The strongest, mumbled the Dogman. He had a bit of a lump in the throat, being honest. Three Trees nodded to himself. It takes some bones to meet your death as well as he did. To walk to it with no complaint, to ask for it. And not for his own sake, but for others that he didn't even know. Three Trees clenched his teeth and took his moment, looking down at the earth. They all did. That's all I've got to say. Back to the mud with you, Fawley. We're the poorer, and the ground's the richer for it. Dow knelt down and set his hand on the fresh-turned soil. Back to the mud, he said. The Dogman thought for a minute there might be a tear dripping off his nose, but it had to be only the rain. This was Black Dow, after all. He got up and walked away with his head down, and the others followed him, one by one, off towards the horses. Fare you well, Forley, said the Dogman. No more fear. He reckoned now that he was the coward of the band. Chapter 43. Misery. Giselle frowned. Ardy was taking her time. She never took her time. She was always there when he arrived, at whatever spot had been arranged. He didn't like having to wait for her one bit. He always had to wait for her letters, and that rankled as it was. Standing here like an idiot, it made him feel even more of a slave than he did already. He frowned up at the grey skies. There were a few spots of rain falling, just to match his mood. He felt one from time to time, a tiny pinprick on his face. He could see the drops making circles in the grey surface of the lake, making pale streaks against the green of the trees, the grey of the buildings. The dark shape of the House of the Maker was rendered hazy by them. He frowned at that building with particular displeasure. He hardly knew what to make of it now. The whole thing had been like some feverish nightmare, and, like a nightmare, he had decided simply to ignore it and pretend it never happened. He might have succeeded, too, except that the bloody thing was always looming on the edge of his vision whenever he stepped out of the door, reminding him the world was full of mysteries he did not understand, seething just below the surface. "Damn it," he muttered. "And damn that lunatic Baez as well." He frowned across the damp lawns. The rain was keeping people away from the park, and it was emptier than he had seen it in a long time. A couple of sad-looking men sat listlessly on benches, nursing their own personal tragedies, and there were passers-by on the paths, hurrying from somewhere to wherever. One was coming towards him now, wrapped up in a long cloak. Giselle's frown vanished. It was her, he could tell. She had her hood pulled right down over her face. He knew it was a cold day, but this seemed a touch dramatic. He had never thought she was the type to be put off by a few spots of rain. Still, he was glad to see her, ridiculously glad. He smiled and hastened forward. Then, when they were a couple of paces apart, she pushed the hood back. Giselle gasped with horror. There was a great purple bruise across her cheek, around her eye, the corner of her mouth. He stood there frozen for a moment, wishing stupidly that he was hurt instead of her. the pain would have been less. He realized he'd clamped one hand over his mouth, eyes bulging like a nervous little girl at a spider in the bath, but he couldn't stop himself. Ardy only scowled. "What? Did you never see a bruise before?" "Well, yes, but are you all right?" "Of course I am." She stepped around him and started walking off down the path. He had to hurry to catch her up. "It's nothing. I fell is all. I'm a clumsy fool. Always have been, all my life." She said it with some bitterness, it seemed to him. "Is there anything I can do?" "What could you do? Kiss it better?" If they'd been alone, he wouldn't have minded trying, but her frown showed him what she thought of that idea. It was strange. The bruises should have repelled him, but they didn't. Not at all. Rather, he had an almost overpowering urge to take her in his arms, to stroke her hair, to murmur soothing words. Pathetic. Probably she would slap him if he tried. Probably he would deserve it. She didn't need his help. Besides, he couldn't touch her. There were people around, damn them, eyes everywhere. You never knew who might be watching. The thought made him more than a little nervous. "Ardy, aren't we taking a risk? I mean, what if your brother were to—" She snorted. "Forget about him. He won't do anything. I've told him to keep his nose out of my business." Giselle had to smile. He imagined that must have been quite an amusing scene. "Besides, I hear that you're all leaving for Angland on the next tide, and I could hardly let you go without saying goodbye, now could I?" "I wouldn't have done that," he said, horrified again. It hurt just hearing her say the word goodbye. "I mean, well, I'd have let them sail without me before I would have done that." Huh. They walked along in silence for a moment, skirting the lake, both with their eyes on the gravel. It was hardly the bitter-sweet farewell that he had pictured so far, just bitter. They passed among the trunks of some willow trees, their branches trailing in the water below. It was a secluded spot, screened from prying eyes. Giselle reckoned he was unlikely to find one better for what he had to say. He glanced sideways at her and took a deep breath. "Ardy, I don't know how long we'll be away. I mean, I suppose it could be months." He chewed at his top lip. It was not coming out at all as he had hoped. He had practiced this speech 20 times at least, staring in his mirror until he got just the right expression. Serious, confident, slightly wheedling. Now, though, the words came out in a foolish rush. I hope that you'll wait for me. I dare say I'll still be here. I've nothing else to do. But don't worry, you'll have a lot to think about in Angland. War, honour, glory, and all that. You'll soon forget about me." "No!" he shouted, catching hold of her arm. "No, I won't!" He pulled his hand away quickly, worried someone might see. At least she was looking at him now, somewhat surprised, maybe, at how fierce his denial had been, though not half as surprised as he was. Giselle blinked down at her. A pretty girl, certainly, but too dark, too tanned, too clever by half, simply dressed with no jewels and with a great ugly bruise across her face. She would hardly have excited much comment in the officers' mess. How was it that she seemed to him the most beautiful woman in the world? The Princess Therese was an unwashed dog beside her. The clever words leaked out of his mind, and he spoke without thinking, looking her straight in the eye. Maybe this was what honesty felt like. "Look, Ardy, I know you think I'm an ass, and, well, I dare say I am, but I don't plan always to be one. I don't know why you even look at me, and I don't know much about this sort of thing, but, well, I think about you all the time. I hardly think about anything else anymore." He took another deep breath. "I think—" He glanced round again, just to check that no one was watching. "I think I love you." She spluttered with laughter. "You really are an ass," she said. Despair. He was utterly crushed. He couldn't breathe for disappointment. His face screwed up, his head drooped, and he stared down at the ground. There were tears in his eyes, actual tears. Pitiful. "But I'll wait." Joy. It swelled in his chest and burst out in a little girlish sob. He was helpless. It was ridiculous, the power she had over him. The difference between misery and happiness was the right word from her. She laughed again. "Look at you, you fool." She reached up and touched his face, rubbed a tear from his cheek with her thumb. "I'll wait," she said, and she smiled at him, that crooked smile. The people had faded, the park, the city, the world. Giselle stared down at Ardi, for how long he could not have said, trying to stamp every detail of her face into his mind. He had a feeling, for some reason, that the memory of that smile might have to get him through a lot. The docks were heaving with activity, even for the docks. The wharves boiled with people. The air shook and rattled with their din. Soldiers and supplies poured endlessly up the slippery gangways and onto the ships. Crates were hauled, barrels were rolled, hundreds of horses were dragged and pushed and kicked aboard, eyes bulging, mouths frothing. Men grunted and groaned, heaved at wet ropes, strained at wet beams, sweating and shouting in the spitting rain, slipping around on the slick decks, running here and there in epic confusion. Everywhere people embraced, kissed, waved to each other, wives saying goodbye to husbands, mothers to sons, children to fathers, all equally bedraggled. Some put a brave face on it, some wept and wailed, others did not care. Spectators come simply to witness the madness. It all meant nothing to Giselle, leaning on the weathered rail of the ship that would carry him to Angland. He was sunk in a terrible gloom, nose running, hair plastered to his scalp with wet. Ardi was not there, and yet she was everywhere. He would hear her voice above the din calling his name. He would glimpse her out of the corner of his eye, looking at him, and his breath would catch in his throat. He would smile, half raise his hand to wave. Then he would see it was not her. Some other dark-haired woman smiling at some other soldier. His shoulders would slump again. Each time the disappointment was sharper. He realized now that he had made a terrible mistake. Why the hell had he asked her to wait for him? Wait for what? He could not marry her, that was a fact. Impossible. But the thought of her even looking at another man made him feel sick. He was wretched. Love. He hated to admit it, but it had to be. He had always regarded the whole notion with contempt, a stupid word, a word for bad poets to harp on and foolish women to chatter about, a thing found in childish stories and with no relevance to the real world, where relationships between men and women were simple matters of fucking and money. Yet here he was, mired in a horrible bog of fear and guilt, lust and confusion, loss and pain. Love. What a curse. "I'd like to see Ardi," murmured Caspar wistfully. Giselle turned to stare at him. "What? What did you say?" "It's quite a sight to see," said the lieutenant, holding his hands up. "That's all." Everyone was a little careful around him since that card game, as if he might blow up at any moment. Giselle turned sullenly back to the crowds. There was some kind of a commotion down below them. A single horseman was forcing his way through the chaos, spurring a well-lathered horse with frequent shouts of, "Move!" Even in the rain, the wings on the rider's helmet glittered, a night herald. "Bad news for someone," murmured Caspar. Giselle nodded. "Looks like us." He was indeed making directly for their ship, leaving a trail of bemused and angry soldiers and workmen behind him. He swung out of the saddle and strode purposefully up the gangplank towards them, face grim, bright-polished armour covered with moisture and jingling with every step. "Captain Luther?" he asked. "Yes," said Giselle. "I'll fetch the colonel." "No need. My message is for you." "It is?" "High Justice Morovia requires your presence at his offices, immediately. It would be best if you took my mount." Giselle frowned. He did not like the taste of this at all. There was no reason that he could see for a Knight Herald to be bringing messages to him, except that he had been inside the house of the Maker. He wanted nothing more to do with that. He wanted it in the past, forgotten, along with Baez and his Northman and that disgusting cripple. "The High Justice is waiting, Captain." "Yes, of course." It seemed there was nothing to be done. "Ah, Captain Luther! An honor to see you again." Giselle was hardly surprised to run into the madman Sulphur, even here outside the offices of the High Justice. He no longer even seemed a madman, just another part of a world gone entirely mad. "An absolute honor!" he frothed. "Likewise," said Giselle numbly. "I'm so lucky I caught you, what with both of us leaving so soon. My master has all manner of errands for me." He gave a deep sigh. "Never the slightest peace, eh?" "No, I know what you mean." "Still, an honor indeed to see you, and victorious at the contest. I saw the whole thing, you know. It was a privilege to bear witness." He smiled broadly, different-coloured eyes glittering. "And to think you were set on giving it up! Ha! But you stuck at it, just as I said you would. Yes, you did, and now you reap the rewards." "The edge of the world," he whispered softly, as though to say the words out loud was to invite disaster. "The edge of the world. Can you imagine? I envy you, indeed I do." Giselle blinked. "What?" "What? Ha! What?" he says. "You are dauntless, sir, dauntless." And Sulphur strode off across the wet square of marshals, chuckling to himself. Giselle was so bemused that he had not even the presence of mind to call him a damn idiot once he was out of earshot. One of Moravia's many clerks ushered him through an empty, echoing hallway towards a pair of enormous doors. He stopped before them, knocked. At an answering cry, he turned the handle and pulled one of the doors back, standing aside politely for Giselle to pass through. "You may go in," he said quietly, after they had been stood there for a while. Yes, of course." The cavernous chamber beyond was eerily silent. Furniture was strangely sparse in that huge panelled space, and what there was seemed oversized, as though for the use of people much bigger than Giselle. It gave him the distinct feeling that he was arriving at his own trial. High Justice Morovia sat behind an enormous table, its surface polished to mirror brightness, smiling at Giselle with a kindly, if slightly pitying expression. Marshal Varouz was seated to his left, staring down guiltily at his own blurry reflection. Giselle had not thought he could feel more depressed, but on seeing the third member of the group, he realized he had been wrong. Baez, wearing a self-satisfied smirk. He felt a mild surge of panic as the door shut behind him. The clicking of the latch felt like the clank of the heavy bolt on a prison cell. Baez started up from his chair and came round the table. "Captain Luther, I am so glad you could join us." The old man took Giselle's damp hand in both of his and squeezed it firmly, leading him forward into the room. "Thank you for coming. Thank you indeed." Of course." As if he had been given a choice. "Well now, you're probably wondering what this is all about. Allow me to explain." He stepped back and perched on the edge of the table like a kindly uncle holding forth to a child. "I and a few brave companions, chosen people, you understand, people of quality, are engaging on a great journey, an epic voyage, a grand adventure. I have little doubt that, should we be successful, there will be stories told of this for years to come, very many years. Byaz's forehead crinkled as he raised his white eyebrows. Well, what do you think? Giselle glanced nervously over at Morovia and Varuz, but they were giving no clues as to what was going on. If I may... Of course, Giselle. I may call you Giselle, may I? Yes. Well, yes, I suppose. The thing is, I was wondering what all this has to do with me. Byaz smiled. We are short a man. There was a long, heavy silence. A drop of water trickled down Giselle's scalp, dripped from his hair, ran down his nose, and pattered against the tiles beneath his feet. Horror crept slowly through his body, from his gut to the very tips of his fingers. Me? He croaked. The road will be a long and difficult one, most likely beset with dangers. We have enemies out there, you and I, more enemies than you would believe. Who could be more useful than a proven swordsman, such as yourself, the winner of the contest, no less? Giselle swallowed. I appreciate the offer, really I do, but I am afraid I must decline. My place is with the army, you understand. He took a hesitant step back towards the door. I must go north. My ship will soon be sailing, and I'm afraid it has sailed already, Captain, said Morovia, his warm voice stopping Giselle dead in his tracks. You need not concern yourself with that any longer. You will not be going to England. But, your worship, my company will find another commander, smiled the High Justice. Understanding, sympathetic, but horribly firm. I appreciate your feelings, indeed I do, but we considered this more urgent. It is important that the Union be represented in this matter. Terribly important, murmured Varuz half-heartedly. Giselle blinked at the three old men. There was no escape. So this was his reward for winning the contest. Some crackpot voyage to who knew where in the company of a demented old man and a pack of savages? How he wished now that he had never started fencing, that he had never even seen a steel in his life. But wishing was useless. There was no way back. I need to serve my country, mumbled Giselle. Byaz laughed. There are other ways to serve your country, my boy, than being one corpse in a pile up there in the frozen north. We leave tomorrow. Tomorrow? But my things are... Don't worry, Captain. And the old man slipped off the table and clapped him enthusiastically on the shoulder. Everything is arranged. Your boxes were brought off the ship before it left. You have this evening to pick out some things for our journey, but we must travel light. Weapons, of course, and stout clothes for travelling. Make sure you pack a good pair of boots, eh? No uniforms, I'm afraid. They might attract the wrong kind of attention where we're going. No, of course, said Giselle miserably. Might I ask, where are we going? The edge of the world, my boy. The edge of the world. Byaz's eyes twinkled. And back, of course. I hope. Chapter 44. The Bloody Nine. Say one thing for Logan Ninefingers. Say that he's happy. They were leaving at last. Beyond some vague talk about the old empire and the edge of the world, he had no idea where they were going, and he didn't care. Anywhere but this cursed place would do for him, and the sooner the better. The latest member of the group didn't seem to share his good spirits. Luther, the proud young man from the gate, the one who'd won the sword game, thanks to Byaz's cheating. He'd barely said 2 words together since he arrived. Just stood there, face rigid and chalky pale, staring out of the window, bolt upright, like he had a spear all the way up his arse. Logan ambled over to him. If you're going to travel with a man, and maybe fight alongside him, it's best to talk, and laugh if you can. That way you can get an understanding and then a trust. Trust is what binds a band together, and out there in the wilds, that can make the difference between living or dying. Building that kind of trust takes time and effort. Logan reckoned it was best to get started early, and today he had good humor to spare. So he stood next to Luthar and looked out at the park, trying to dream up some common ground in which to plant the seeds of an unlikely friendship. Beautiful. You're home. He didn't think it was, but he was short on ideas. Luthar turned from the window, looked Logan haughtily up and down. What would you know about it? I reckon one man's thoughts are worth about as much as another's, sneered the young man coldly. Then I suppose that's where we differ. He turned back to the view. Logan took a deep breath. The trust might be a while coming. He abandoned Luthar and tried Quai instead. But the apprentice was scarcely more promising, slumped in a chair, frowning at nothing. Logan sat down next to him. Aren't you looking forward to going home? Home, mumbled the apprentice listlessly. That's right, the old empire, or wherever. You don't know what it's like there. You could tell me, said Logan, hoping to hear something about the peaceful valleys, cities, rivers, and whatnot. Bloody. It's bloody there, and lawless, and life is cheap as dirt. Bloody and lawless. That all had an unpleasantly familiar smack to it. Isn't there an emperor or something? There are many, always making war on one another, forging alliances that last a week, or a day, or an hour, before they scramble to be first to stab each other in the back. When one emperor falls, another rises, and another, and meanwhile the hopeless and the dispossessed scavenge and loot and kill on the fringes. The cities dwindle, the great works of the past fall into ruin, the crops go unharvested, and the people go hungry. Bloodshed and betrayal, hundreds of years of it. The feuds have become so deep, so complicated, that few can tell any longer who hates who, and no one can say why. There's no need for reasons anymore. Logan made one last effort. You never know. Things might have got better. Why? Muttered the apprentice. Why? Logan was fumbling for a reply when one of the doors swung briskly open. Baez frowned around the room. Where's Melgin? Quai swallowed. She left. I can see she left. I thought I told you to keep her here. You didn't tell me how, muttered the apprentice. His master ignored him. What the hell has become of that bloody woman? We must be away by noon. 3 days I've known her, and she already has me at the end of my rope. He clenched his teeth and took a deep breath. Find her, will you, Logan? Find her and bring her back. What if she doesn't want to come back? I don't know. Pick her up and carry her. You can kick her all the way back here as far as I'm concerned. Easy to say, but Logan didn't fancy trying it. Still, if it had to be done before they could leave, it was best done now. He sighed, got up from his chair, and made for the door. Logan pressed himself into the shadows by the wall, watching. Shit, he whispered to himself. It would have to be now, just as they were about to leave. Pharaoh was 20 strides away, standing up tall, with a deeper-than-usual scowl on her dark face. There were 3 men gathered round her, masked men, all in black. Their sticks were down by their legs, behind their backs, kept half out of sight, but Logan had no doubt about what they had in mind. He could hear one of them talking, hissing through his mask, something about coming quietly. He winced. Coming quietly didn't sound like Pharaoh's style. He wondered whether he should slip away and tell the others. He couldn't really say he liked the woman much, not near enough to get his head broken for her. But if he left them to it, 3 against 1, the chances were they'd have knocked her to pieces by the time he got back, however tough she was. and dragged her off to who knew where. He might never get out of this damn city then. He started judging the distance, thinking about how best to go at them, weighing his chances. But he'd been too long doing nothing, and his mind moved slowly. He was still working on it when Pharaoh suddenly jumped on one of them, yelling at the top of her voice, knocking him on his back. She gave him a couple of vicious-looking punches in the face before the others caught hold of her and dragged her up. "Shit!" hissed Logan. The three of them wrestled, lurching around in the lane, knocking against the walls, grunting and swearing, kicking and punching, a tangle of flailing limbs. It seemed that time had run out for a clever approach. Logan gritted his teeth and charged towards them. The one on the floor had rolled to his feet, shaking the fuzz out of his head, while the other two struggled to get a good grip on Pharaoh. Now he lifted his stick high, arching back, ready to smash her on the skull. Logan let go a roar. The masked face snapped round, surprised-looking. "Huh?" Then Logan's shoulder crunched into his ribs, lifting him off his feet and sending him sprawling. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw someone swing a stick at him, but he'd got them off guard, and there was no real force behind it. He caught it across his arm, then pressed in under it and smashed the man right in the mask with his fists, a full-blooded punch with each hand. He reeled back, arms flopping, already falling. Logan grabbed him by two fistfuls of his black coat, hauled him into the air, and flung him upside down into the wall. He bounced off with a gurgle and crumpled on the cobbles. Logan spun round, fists clenched, but the last one was lying on his face with Pharaoh on top of him, one knee jammed into his back, pulling his head up by the hair and smashing his face into the road, shouting meaningless curses all the while. "What did you fucking do?" he shouted, grabbing her under the elbow and dragging her off. She tore free of his grip and stood there, panting, fists bunched up by her sides, blood leaking out of her nose. "Nothing," she snarled. Logan took a cautious step back. "Nothing? What's this, then?" She bit off each word in her ugly accent and spat them at him. "I don't know." She wiped her bloody mouth with one hand, then froze. Logan glanced over his shoulder. 3 more masked men running at them down the narrow lane. "Shit! Move, Pink!" Pharaoh turned and started running, and Logan followed her. What else could he do? He ran. The horrible, breathless running of the hunted, shoulders prickling for a blow in the back, sucking in air in gasps, the slapping footfalls of the men behind echoing around him. High white buildings flashed past on either side, windows, doors, statues, gardens. People, too, shouting as they dived out of the way or flattening themselves against the walls. He had no idea where they were, no idea where they were going. A man stepped out of a doorway right in front of him, a big sheaf of papers in his arms. They crashed together, tumbled to the ground, rolling over and over in the gutter, with papers flapping down all around them. He tried to get up, but his legs were burning. He couldn't see. There was a piece of paper across his face. He tore it away, felt someone grab him under the arm and haul him along. "Up, Pink! Move!" Pharaoh. She wasn't even out of breath. Logan's lungs were bursting as he struggled to keep up with her, but she pulled steadily away, head down, feet flying. She charged through an archway just ahead, and Logan laboured after her, boots skidding as he turned the corner. A great shadowy space, timbers reaching up high above, like a strange forest of square beams. Where the hell were they? There was bright light just ahead, open air. He plunged out into it, blinking. Pharaoh was just behind him, turning round slowly, breathing hard. They were in the middle of a circle of grass, a little circle. He knew where they were now. The arena where he'd sat among the crowds, watching the sword game. The empty benches stretched away all around. There were carpenters crawling amongst them, sawing and hammering. They'd already taken some of the benches to pieces near the back, and the supports stuck up high into the air, alone like giant rib bones. He put his hands on his wobbly knees and bent over, gasping for air, blowing spit out onto the ground. "What now?" This way! Logan straightened up with an effort and wobbled after her, but she was already on her way back. Not that way! Logan saw them, black masked figures again. The one at the front was a woman, tall, with a shock of red hair sprouting off her head. She padded towards the circle silently on the balls of her feet, waved her arm behind her, pointing the other two out to the sides, trying to get on the flanks around him. Logan cast about looking for a weapon, but there was nothing, just the empty benches and the high white walls beyond. Pharaoh was backing towards him, not 10 feet away, and beyond her there were 2 more masks, creeping out around the enclosures with sticks in their hands. 5 altogether. Shit, he said. What the hell is keeping them? Growled Baez, pacing the floor. Giselle had never seen the old man annoyed before, and for some reason it made him nervous. Whenever he came close, Giselle wanted to back away. I'm having a bath, damn it! Could be months before my next one, months! Baez stalked out of the room and slammed the bathroom door behind him, leaving Giselle alone with the apprentice. They were probably close enough in age, but they had nothing else in common, so far as Giselle could see, and he stared with unconcealed contempt. A sickly, weaselly, puny, bookish sort. Sulking like that, moping around, it was pathetic. Rude, too, damn rude. Giselle fumed silently. Just who did he think he was, the arrogant pup? What the hell did he have to be so upset about? It wasn't him who'd had his life stolen out from under him. Still, if he had to be left alone with one of them, he supposed it could have been worse. It might have been the moron Northman with his fumbling, thick-tongued small talk, or that gurkish witch staring and staring with her devil-yellow eyes. He shuddered to think of it. People of quality, Baez had said. He would have laughed had he not been on the verge of tears. Giselle cast himself down on the cushions in a high-backed chair, but he found scant comfort there. His friends were on their way to Angland now, and he missed them already. West, Casper, Jallenhorn, even that bastard Brint. On their way to honour, on their way to fame. The campaign would be long finished by the time he returned from whatever pit the old madman was leading him to, if he returned at all. Who knew when the next war would be, the next chance of glory? How he wished he was going to fight the Northmen. How he wished he was with Ardi. It seemed like an age since he was happy. His life was awful. Awful. He lay back listlessly in his chair, wondering if things could possibly be any worse. "Gah!" growled Logan as a stick cracked into his arm, then another into his shoulder, one in his side. He stumbled back, half on his knees, fending them away as best he could. He could hear Pharaoh screaming somewhere behind him, fury or pain he couldn't say. He was too busy taking a battering. Something smacked across his skull, hard enough to send him reeling away towards the seats. He fell on his face, and the front bench hit him in the chest, driving the air from his lungs. There was blood running down his scalp, on his hands, in his mouth. His eyes were watering from a blow to the nose. His knuckles were all skinned and bloody, near as ripped as his clothes were. He lay there for a moment, gathering whatever strength was left. There was a thick length of timber lying on the ground behind the bench. He grabbed hold of the end of it. It was loose. He dragged it towards him. It felt good in his hand, heavy. He sucked in air, summoning one more effort. He moved his arms and legs a little, testing them. Nothing broken. Except his nose, maybe, but it was hardly the first time. He heard footsteps coming up behind, slow footsteps, taking their time. He pushed himself up, slowly, trying to look as though he was in a daze. Then he let go a roar and spun round, swinging the timber over his head. It broke in half across the masked man's shoulder with a mighty crack, half of it flying up off the turf and clattering away. The man gave a muffled wail and sank down, eyes screwed shut, one hand clutching at his neck, the other hanging useless, stick dropping from his fingers. Logan hefted the short piece of wood left in his hands and clubbed him across the face with it. It snapped his head back and drove him into the turf, mask half torn off, blood bubbling out from underneath. Logan's head exploded with light, and he tottered and sagged down onto his knees. Someone had hit him in the back of the head, hit him hard. He swayed there for a moment, trying to stop himself falling on his face. Then things came suddenly back into focus. The red-haired woman was standing over him, raising her stick high. Logan shoved himself up, flailed into her, fumbled with her arm, half pulling at her, half leaning on her, ears ringing, the world swinging madly. They staggered around, tugging on the stick like two drunkards wrestling over a bottle, back and forth in the circle of grass. He felt her punching him in the side with her other hand. Hard punches, right in the ribs. "Ah!" he growled, but his head was clearing now, and she was half his weight. He twisted the arm with the stick around behind her back. She punched him again, a knock on the side of his face that brought the stars back for an instant. But then he got hold of her other wrist and pinned that arm as well. He bent her backwards over his knee. She kicked and twisted, eyes screwed up to furious slits, but Logan had her fast. He freed his right hand from the tangle of limbs, brought his fist up high, and smashed it into her stomach. She gave a breathy wheeze and went limp, eyes bulging. He flung her away, and she crawled a foot or two, pulled her mask down, and started coughing puke onto the grass. Logan stumbled and swayed, shook his head, spitting blood and dirt out onto the grass. Aside from the retching woman, there were 4 black, crumpled shapes stretched out in the circle. One of them was grunting softly as Pharaoh kicked him over and over. She had blood all over her face, but she was smiling. "I am still alive," Logan muttered to himself. "I am still." There were more of them coming through the archway. He swung around, almost falling over. More, 4 more from the other side. They were trapped. "Move, Pink!" Pharaoh dashed past him and sprang up onto the first bench, then the second, then the third, springing between them with great strides. Madness. Where was she going to go from there? Red Hair had stopped puking. She was crawling towards her fallen stick. The others were closing in fast, more of them than ever. Pharaoh was already a quarter of the way back and showing no signs of slowing, bounding from one bench to the next, making the planks rattle. Shit! Logan set off after her. After a dozen benches, his legs were burning again. He gave up trying to spring between them and started scrambling however he could. As he flopped over the backs of the benches, he could see the masked men behind, following, watching, pointing and calling, spreading out through the seats. He was slowing now. Each bench was a mountain. The nearest mask was only a few rows behind. He scrambled on, higher and higher, bloody hands clutching at the wood, bloody knees scraping across the benches, skull echoing with his own breath, skin prickling with sweat and fear. Air loomed suddenly empty before him. He stopped, gasping, arms waving, teetering on the edge of a dizzying drop. He was close to the high roofs of the buildings behind, but most of the seating near the back had already been taken down, leaving the supports exposed. Single looming pillars, narrow beams between them, and a lot of high, empty space. He watched Pharaoh spring from one soaring upright to another, then run across a wobbling plank, heedless of the plunging space below. She jumped off onto a flat roof at the far end, high above him. It seemed a very long way away. Shit! Logan teetered out across the nearest beam, arms stretched out wide for balance, feet moving in an old man's shuffle. His heart was banging like a smith's hammer on an anvil. His knees were weak and wobbling from the climb. He tried to ignore the scrambling and shouting of the men behind him and look only at the knotted surface of the beam, but he couldn't look down without seeing the spider's web of timbers below him and the tiny flagstones of the square below them, far below. He lurched onto a stretch of walkway still intact, clattered up it to the far end. He hauled himself up onto a timber above his head, locked his legs around it, and dragged himself along on his arse, whispering, I am still alive, to himself over and over. The nearest mask had made it to the walkway, was running along it towards him. The beam ended at the top of one of the upright struts, a square of wood a foot or two across. Then there was nothing. 2 strides of empty air, then another square at the top of another dizzying mast, then the plank to the flat roof. Pharaoh stared at him from the parapet. "Jump!" she screamed. "Jump, you pink bastard!" He jumped. He felt the wind around him. His left foot landed on the square of wood, but there was no stopping. His right foot hit the plank. His ankle twisted, his knee buckled. The dizzy world pitched. His left foot came down, half on the wood, half off. The plank rattled. He was in the empty air, limbs flailing. It seemed like a long time. Oof! The parapet crashed into his chest. His arms clawed with it, but there was no breath left in him. He began to slide back, ever so slowly, inch by terrible inch. First he could see the roof, then he could see his hands, then he could see nothing but the stones in front of his face. "Help!" he whispered, but no help came. It was a long way down, he knew that. A long, long way, and there was no water to fall into this time. Only hard, flat, fatal stone. He heard a rattling. The mask coming across the plank behind him. He heard someone shouting, but none of it mattered much now. He slipped backwards a little further, hands scrabbling at the crumbling mortar. "Help!" he croaked, but there was no one to help him. Only the masks and Pharaoh, and none of them seemed like the helping kind. He heard a clunk and a despairing shriek. Pharaoh kicking the plank and the mask falling. The scream fell away. It felt like for a long time, then it was cut off in a distant thud. The mask's body smashing to pulp against the ground far below, and Logan knew he was about to join him. You have to be realistic about these things. There would be no washing up on a riverbank this time. His fingertips were slipping slowly. The mortar was starting to come apart. The fighting, the running, the climb, they had all sucked the strength out of him, and now there was nothing left. He wondered what sound he would make as he plunged through the air. "Help!" he mouthed. And strong fingers closed around his wrist. Dark, dirty fingers. He heard growling, felt his arm being pulled, hard. He groaned. The edge of the parapet came back into view. He saw Pharaoh now, teeth gritted, eyes squeezed almost shut with effort, veins standing out from her neck, scar livid against her dark face. He clutched at the parapet with his other hand, his chest came up beyond it, he managed to force his knee over. She hauled him the rest of the way, and he rolled and flopped on his back on the other side, gasping like a landed fish, staring up at the white sky. "I am still alive," he muttered to himself after a moment, hardly able to believe it. It wouldn't have been too much of a surprise if Pharaoh had trodden on his hands and helped him fall. Her face appeared above him, yellow eyes staring down, teeth bared in a snarl. "You stupid, heavy pink bastard!" She turned away, shaking her head, stalked to a wall, and started climbing, hauling herself up fast towards a low-pitched roof above. Logan winced as he watched her. Did she never get tired? His arms were battered, bruised, scratched all over. His legs ached, his nose had started bleeding again. Everything hurt. He turned and looked down. One mask was staring at him from the edge of the benches 20 strides away. A few more were scurrying around below, looking for some way up. Far below, in the yellow circle of grass, he could see a thin black figure with red hair pointing around, then up at him, giving orders. Sooner or later they would find a way up. Pharaoh was perched on the peak of the roof above him, a ragged, dark shape against the bright sky. "Stay there if you want," she barked, then turned and disappeared. Logan groaned as he stood up, groaned as he shuffled to the wall, sighed as he began to search for a handhold. Where is everyone?" demanded Brother Longfoot. "Where is my illustrious employer? Where is Master Ninefingers? Where is the charming Lady Malgin?" Giselle looked around. The sickly apprentice was sunk too deep in self-centered gloom to answer. "I don't know about the other two, but Baez is in the bath." "I swear I never came upon a man more attached to bathing than he. I hope the others will not be long. All is prepared, you know. The ship is ready. The stores are loaded. It is not my way to delay. Indeed it is not. We must catch the tide or be stuck here until—" The little man paused, staring up at Giselle with a sudden concern. "You seem upset, my young friend. Troubled, indeed. Can I, Brother Longfoot, be of any assistance?" Giselle had half a mind to tell him to mind his own business, but he settled for an irritated, "No, no. I'd wager that there is a woman involved. Would I be right?" Giselle looked up sharply, wondering how the man could have guessed. "Your wife, perhaps?" "No, I'm not married. It's nothing like that. It's, well—" He fumbled for the words to describe it and failed. "It's nothing like that is all." "Ah," said the navigator with a knowing grin. "Ah, a forbidden love, then. A secret love, is it?" Much to his annoyance, Giselle found that he was blushing. "I am right, I see it. There is no fruit so sweet as the one you cannot taste. Eh, my young friend? Eh, eh?" He waggled his eyebrows in what Giselle felt was a most unsavoury fashion. "I wonder what's keeping those two." Giselle didn't care in the least, but anything to change the subject. "Malgin and Ninefingers?" "Ha!" laughed Longfoot, leaning towards him. "Perhaps they've become involved, eh, in a secret love like yours? Perhaps they've crept off somewhere to do what comes naturally?" He nudged Giselle in the ribs. "Can you imagine those two? That'd be something, wouldn't it? Ha!" Giselle grimaced. The hideous Northman he already knew for an animal, and from what little he'd seen of that evil woman, she might well be worse. All he could imagine coming naturally to them was violence. The idea was perfectly revolting. He felt soiled just thinking about it. The roofs seemed to go on forever. Up one, down another, creeping along the peaks, one slippery foot on either side, edging across ledges, stepping over crumbling bits of wall. Sometimes Logan would look up for a moment, get a dizzying view across the tumbling mass of damp slates, pitted tiles, ancient lead, to the distant wall of the Agriont, sometimes even the city far beyond. It might almost have been peaceful, if it wasn't for Pharaoh, fast-moving, sure-footed, cursing at him and pulling him on, giving him no time to think about the view, or the nerve-wracking drops they skirted, or the black figures, surely still seeking for them below. One of her sleeves had been torn half off sometime in the fighting, flapping around her wrist, getting in the way as they climbed. She snarled and ripped it away at the shoulder. Logan smiled to himself as he recalled the efforts Baez had gone to in getting her to change her old stinking rags for new clothes. Now she was filthier than ever, shirt sweated through, spotted with blood and caked with grime from the rooftops. She looked over her shoulder and saw him watching her. "Move, Pink!" she hissed at him. "You see no colours, right?" She clambered on, ignoring him, swinging around a smoking chimney and slithering across the dirty slates on her belly, sliding down onto a narrow ledge between two roofs. Logan scrambled down behind her. "No colours at all." "So?" she threw over her shoulder. "So why do you call me Pink?" She looked round. "Are you pink?" Logan peered at his forearms. Aside from the mottled bruises, red scratches, blue veins, they were sort of pink, it had to be said. He frowned. "Thought so." She scurried away between the roofs, right to the end of the building, and peered down. Logan followed her, leaned out gingerly over the edge. A couple of people were moving around in the lane below, far below, and there was no way down. They'd have to go back the way they came. Pharaoh had already moved away behind him. Wind flicked at the side of Logan's face. Pharaoh's foot slapped against the edge of the roof, and then she was in the air. His jaw hung open as he watched her fly away, back arched, arms and legs flailing. She landed on a flat roof, grey lead streaked with green moss, rolled once, then came up smoothly to her feet. Logan licked his lips, pointed at his chest. She nodded. The flat roof was 10 feet below, but there might have been 20 feet of empty air between him and it was a long way down. He backed away slowly, giving himself a good run-up. He sucked in a couple of deep breaths, closed his eyes for a moment. It would be perfect, in a way, if he fell. No songs, no stories, just a bloody smear on a road somewhere. He started running. His feet thumped on the stone. The air whistled in his mouth, plucked at his torn clothes. The flat roof came flying up towards him. He landed with a shuddering impact, rolled once, just as Pharaoh had done, stood up beside her. He was still alive. "Ha!" he shouted. "What do you think of that?" There was a creaking sound, then a cracking, then the roof gave way under Logan's feet. He grabbed despairingly at Pharaoh as he fell, and she slid through after him, helpless. He tumbled in the air for a sickening moment, wailing, hands clutching at nothing. He crashed down on his back. Logan coughed on choking dust, shook his head, shifted painfully. He was in a room, inky dark after the brightness outside. Dust was filtering down through the light from the ragged hole in the roof above. There was something soft under him. A bed. It had half collapsed, leaning at an angle, blankets covered in broken plaster. There was something across his legs. Pharaoh. He snorted a gurgling laugh to himself. In bed with a woman again at last. Unfortunately, it wasn't quite what he'd been hoping for. "Stupid fucking pink!" she snarled, scrabbling off him and over to the door, bits of wood and plaster sliding off her dusty back. She hauled on the doorknob. "Locked! It's—" Logan crashed past her, ripping the door off its hinges and sprawling out into the corridor beyond. Pharaoh sprang over him. "Up, Pink, up!" A handy-looking length of wood had split from the edge of the door, a couple of nails sticking out of the end. Logan snatched it up in his hand. He struggled to his feet, stumbled down the corridor a few paces, came to a junction. A shadowy hallway stretched away to either side. Small windows cast sharp pools of light on the dark matting. No way to tell which way Pharaoh had gone. He turned right towards a flight of stairs. There was a figure moving carefully down the dim corridor towards him. Long and thin like a black spider in the darkness, balanced on the balls of its feet. A chink of light shone on bright red hair. "You again," said Logan, weighing the length of wood in his hand. "That's right, me." There was a jingling sound, a flash of metal in the dark. Logan felt the piece of wood ripped out of his fingers, and he saw it fly over the woman's shoulder and clatter away down the corridor. Unarmed again, but she didn't give him long to worry about it. There was something in her hand, something like a knife, and she threw it at him. He ducked out of the way, and it hissed past his ear. Then she jerked her other arm, and something slashed him across the face, just under his eye. He lurched back against the wall, trying to understand what kind of magic he was facing. It was like a metal cross, the thing in her hand. 3 curved blades, one with a hook on the end. A chain looped from a ring on the handle and disappeared up her sleeve. The knife thing darted out, missed Logan's face by an inch as he bobbed away, struck a shower of sparks as it ripped back along the wall and slapped smoothly back into her hand. She let it drop, swinging gently from its chain, rattling against the floor, jumping and dancing towards him as she edged forward. She jerked her wrist, and the thing shot out at Logan again, slashed across his chest as he tried to get away, spattering drops of blood against the wall. He dived at her, but his outspread arms caught nothing. There was a rattle, and he felt his foot dragged from under him. His ankle snapped round painfully, caught by the chain as she ducked by. He sprawled out on his face, started to push himself up. The chain snaked under his neck. He just got his hand behind it before it snapped taut. The woman was on top of him. He could feel her knee pressing into his back, could hear her breath hissing through her mask as she pulled, the chain growing tighter and tighter, cutting into the palm of his hand. Logan grunted, scrabbling to his knees, lumbering unsteadily to his feet. The woman was still on his back, all her weight bearing down on him, pulling at the chain as hard as she could. Logan flailed around with his free hand, but he couldn't get at her, couldn't throw her off. She was like a barnacle stuck fast to him. He could hardly breathe now. He tottered forward a few steps, then dropped over backwards. "Ah!" whispered the woman in his ear as his weight crushed her into the floor. The chain went slack enough for Logan to drag it clear and slither out from under it. Free. He rolled over and grabbed the woman's neck with his left hand, started squeezing. She kneed at him, dug at him with her fists, but his weight was across her and the blows were weak. They snarled and gasped and croaked at each other, animal sounds, faces only inches apart. A couple of spots of blood dripped from the cut on his cheek and pattered on her mask. Her hand came up and started fumbling with his face, pushing his head back. Her finger forced its way up his nose. "Ah!" he screamed. Pain stabbed up into his head. He let go of her and staggered up, one hand clasped to his face. She scrambled away, coughing, landed a kick in his ribs that bent him over, but he still had a grip on the chain, and he yanked on it with all his weight. Her arm snapped out, and she yelped and flew straight into him, his knees sinking into her side, crushing the breath out of her. Logan grabbed hold of the back of her shirt, half lifted her off the floor, and flung her down the stairs. She rolled and flopped and bounced her way down, slid to a stop on her side near the bottom. Logan was half tempted to follow her down and finish the job, but he had no time. There'd be more where she came from. He turned and hobbled back the other way, cursing his twisted ankle. Sounds crept up on him from all around, echoing down the corridor from who knew where. Distant rattling and banging, shouts and cries. He stared into darkness, limping, running with sweat, one hand on the wall to steady himself. He leaned round a corner, trying to see if it was clear. He felt something cold across his neck. A knife. "Still alive?" whispered a voice in his ear. "You don't die easy, eh, Pink?" Pharaoh. He slowly pushed her arm away. "Where'd you get the knife?" He wished he had one. "He gave it me." There was a crumpled shape in the shadows by the wall, the matting all round soaked with dark blood. "This way." Pharaoh crept off down the corridor, keeping low in the darkness. He could still hear the sounds beneath them, beside them, all around them. They crept down a flight of stairs, out into a dim hallway panelled with dark wood. Pharaoh ducked from shadow to shadow, moving fast. Logan could do no more than limp after her, dragging his leg, trying not to squeal with pain whenever he put his weight on it. "There! It's them!" Figures in the dim corridor behind. He turned to run, but Pharaoh held her arm out. There were more, coming the other way. There was a big door on his left, standing open a crack. "In here!" Logan shoved his way through, and Pharaoh darted in after him. There was a heavy piece of furniture beside it, a big cupboard thing with shelves on top covered in plates. Logan grabbed hold of one end and dragged it across in front of the doors, a couple of the plates dropping off and smashing on the floor. He pressed his back against it. That should hold them for a moment, at least. A big room with a high vaulted ceiling. Two huge windows took up most of one wood-panelled wall, a big stone fireplace facing them. A long table stood between, 10 chairs on either side, set for eating with cutlery and candlesticks. A big dining room, and there was only one way in, or out. Logan heard muffled shouting beyond the door. The big cupboard wobbled against his back. Another plate clattered from its shelf, bounced off his shoulder, and smashed on the stone flags, scattering fragments across the floor. "Nice fucking plan," snarled Pharaoh. Logan's feet slid as he strained to hold the teetering cupboard up. She dashed over to the nearest window, fumbled at the metal frames round the little panes, prizing with her fingernails, but there was no way out. Logan's eye caught on something, an old great sword mounted over the fireplace as an ornament. A weapon. He gave the cupboard one last shove, then hurried over to it, seized hold of the long hilt in both hands, and ripped it from its bracket. It was blunt as a plough, the heavy blade spotted with rust, but still solid. A blow from it might not cut a man in half, but it would knock him down all right. He turned just in time to see the cupboard tipping over, dropping shattering crockery all over the stone floor. Black figures spilled into the room, masked figures. The one at the front had an evil-looking axe, the next a short-bladed sword. The one behind him was dark-skinned, with gold rings through his ears. He had a long, curved dagger in either hand. Those weapons were not for knocking a man on the head with, not unless they meant to knock his brains right out. Seemed that they'd given up on taking prisoners. Killing weapons, meant to kill. Well, so much the better, Logan told himself. If you say one thing for Logan Ninefingers, and one thing only, say he's a killer. He eyed those black-masked men clambering over the fallen cupboard, spreading out cautiously around the far wall. He glanced over at Pharaoh, lips curled back, knife in her hand, yellow eyes sparkling. He fingered the grip of his stolen sword, heavy and brutal. Just the tool for the job, for once. He plunged at the nearest mask, yelling at the top of his voice, swinging the sword over his head. The man tried to duck away, but the tip of the blade caught him on the shoulder and knocked him reeling. Another one jumped in behind him, chopping with his axe, sending Logan stumbling away, gasping as his weight went onto his bad ankle. He flailed around with the big sword, but there were too many. One scrambled over the table, got between him and Pharaoh. Something hit him in the back, and he stumbled, spun, slipped, lashed out with the sword, and hit something soft. Somebody screamed, but by then the one with the axe was coming for him again. Everything was a mess of masks and iron, clashing, scraping weapons, curses and cries, ragged breathing. Logan swung the sword, but he was so tired, so hurt, so aching. The sword was heavy and getting heavier all the time. The mask weaved out of the way, and the rusty blade clanged into the wall, knocking a great chunk out of the wooden panelling and biting into the plaster behind, the shock nearly jarring it out of his hands. "Oof!" he breathed as the man kneed him in the stomach. Something hit him in the leg, and he nearly fell. He could hear somebody yelling behind, but it seemed far away. His chest was hurting, his mouth was sour. There was blood on him, all over him. He could hardly breathe. The mask stepped forward, and again, smiling, smelling victory. Logan lurched back towards the fireplace, his foot slipping, falling down on one knee. All things come to an end. He couldn't lift the old sword anymore. There was no strength left, nothing. The room was growing blurry. All things come to an end, but some only lie still, forgotten. There was a cold feeling in Logan's stomach, a feeling he hadn't felt for a long time. "No," he whispered. "I'm free of you." But it was too late, too late. There was blood on him, but that was good. There was always blood, but he was kneeling, and that was wrong. The bloody 9 kneels to no man. His fingers sought out the cracks between the stones of the fireplace, prizing between them like old tree roots, pulling him up. His leg hurt, and he smiled. Pain was the fuel that made the fires burn. Something moved in front of him. Masked men, enemies. Corpses, then. "You're hurt, Northman!" The eyes of the closest one sparkled above his mask. The shining blade of his axe danced in the air.
Want to give up yet?
Hurt? The Bloody Nine threw back his head and laughed. I'll fucking show you, hurt! He tumbled forward, flowed beneath the axe, slippery as fishes in the river, swinging the heavy blade in a great low circle. It crunched into the man's knee and cracked it back the wrong way, scythed on into his other leg and ripped it out from under him. He gave a muffled scream as he spun onto the stones, turning round and round in the air, shattered legs flopping. Something dug into the Bloody Nine's back, but there was no pain. It was a sign, a message in a secret tongue that only he could understand. It told him where the next dead man was standing. He reeled around, and the sword followed him in a furious, beautiful, irresistible arc. It crunched into someone's guts, folded him in half, snatched him off his feet, and flung him through the air. He bounced from the wall beside the fireplace and crumpled on the floor in a shower of broken plaster. A knife whirled, hissing, stuck deep into the Bloody Nine's shoulder with a damp thud. The black one, with the rings through his ears. He had thrown it. He was on the other side of the table, smiling, pleased with his throw. A terrible mistake. The Bloody Nine came for him. Another knife flashed past, clattered against the wall. He sprang over the table, and the sword followed behind. The dark man dodged the first great swing, and the second. Fast and tricky clever, but not clever enough. The third blow bit him in the side. A glancing bite, just a nibble. It only smashed his ribs and knocked him screaming to his knees. The last one was better. A circle of flesh and iron that carved into his mouth and ripped his head half off, showering blood across the walls. The Bloody Nine plucked the knife from his shoulder and tossed it to the floor. Blood ran from the wound, soaked through his shirt, and made a great, lovely, warm red stain. He dropped and faded away, leaves falling from the tree, rolling across the ground. A man lunged past, slashing at the air where he had stood with a short-bladed sword. Before he could turn, the Bloody Nine was on him, left hand snaking round his fists. He struggled and strained, but it was useless. The Bloody Nine's grip was strong as the roots of mountains, relentless as the tide. "They send such as you to fight me?" He flung the man back against the wall and squeezed, crushing his hands around the grip of his weapon, turning the short blade until it was pointing at his chest. "A fucking insult!" he roared, spitting him on his own sword. The man screamed and screamed behind his mask, and the Bloody Nine laughed and twisted the blade. Logan might have pitied him, but Logan was far away, and the Bloody Nine had no more pity in him than the winter, less even. He stabbed and cut and smiled, and the screams bubbled and died, and he let the corpse drop to the cold stones. His fingers were slick with blood, and he wiped it on his clothes, on his arms, on his face, just as it should be. The one by the fireplace was sitting, hanging limp, head back, eyes like wet stones staring at the ceiling. Part of the earth now. The Bloody Nine smashed his face open with the sword, just to make sure. Best to leave no doubts. The one who'd had the axe was crawling for the door, legs twisted out and dragging over the stones behind him, gasping and whimpering all the way. "Quiet now." The heavy blade crunched into the back of the man's skull and sprayed his blood across the stones. "More," he whispered, and the room turned around him as he sought out the next kill. "More!" he bellowed, and he laughed, and the walls laughed, and the corpses laughed with him. "Where's the rest of you?" He saw a dark-skinned woman with a bleeding cut on her face and a knife in her hand. She didn't look like the others, but she would do just as well. He smiled, crept forward, raising the sword in both hands. She stepped away, watching him, keeping the table between them, hard yellow eyes like the wolf. A tiny voice seemed to tell him that she was on his side. Shame. Northerner, eh? Asked a massive shape in the doorway. Aye. Who's asking? The Stone Splitter. He was big, this one. Very big, and tough, and savage. You could see it on him as he shoved the cupboard away with his huge boot and crunched forward through the broken plates. It meant less than nothing to the Bloody Nine, though. He was made to break such men. Talduru Thunderhead had been bigger. Rud Three Trees had been tougher. Black Dow had been twice as savage. The Bloody Nine had broken them and plenty more besides. The bigger, the tougher, the more savage he was, so much the worse would be his breaking. "Stone shitter!" laughed the Bloody Nine. "So fucking what? Next to die is what you are, and nothing more." He held his left hand up, spattered with red blood, 3 fingers spread out wide, grinning through the gap where the middle one used to be a long time ago. "They call me the Bloody Nine." The Stone Splitter ripped off his mask and threw it on the floor. "Liar! There's plenty of men on the north have lost a finger. They ain't all 9 fingers." "No, only me." That great face twisted up with rage. "Ye fucking liar! You think to scare the Stone Splitter with a name that's not your own? I'll carve a new ass in you, maggot! I'll put the bloody cross on you! I'll put you back in the mud, you coward fucking liar!" "Kill me?" The Bloody Nine laughed louder than ever. "I do the killing, fool!" The talk was done. Stone Splitter came at him with axe in one hand and mace in the other, great heavy weapons, though he used them quick enough. The mace swung across, smashed a great hole through the glass in one of the windows. The axe came down, split one timber of the table in half, made the plates jump in the air, the candlesticks topple. The Bloody Nine twitched away, frog-hopping, waiting for his time. The mace missed his shoulder by an inch as he rolled across the table, cracked one of the big flat stones on the floor, split it down the middle, chips flying through the air. Stone Splitter roared, swinging his weapons, smashing a chair in half, knocking a chunk of stone out of the fireplace, chopping a great gash in the wall. His axe stuck fast in the wood for a moment, and the Bloody Nine sword flashed over, broke the haft into splintered halves, leaving the Stone Splitter with a broken stick in his paw. He flung it away and hefted the mace, came on even harder, swinging it round with furious bellows. It sailed over, and the Bloody Nine sword caught it just below the head, ripped it out of the big hand. It twisted through the air and clattered into the corner. But the Stone Splitter pressed forward, spreading his great hands out wide. Too close to use the big sword now. Stone Splitter smiled as his huge arms closed around the Bloody Nine, folding him tight, holding him fast. "Got ya!" he shouted, squeezing him in a great hug. An awful mistake. Better to embrace the burning fire. Crack! The Bloody Nine's forehead smashed into his mouth. He felt the Stone Splitter's grip slacken a little, and he wriggled his shoulders, making room, wriggling, mole in his burrow. He swung his head back as far as it would go. Billy goat charges. The second headbutt smashed the Stone Splitter's flat nose open. He grunted, and the big arms released a little more. The third cracked his cheekbone. The arms fell away. The fourth broke his heavy jaw. Now it was the Bloody Nine holding him up, smiling as he mashed his forehead into the shattered face. Woodpecker pecking. Tap, tap, tap. 5, 6, 7, 8. There was a satisfying rhythm to the crunching of the face bones. 9, and he let the Stone Splitter fall. He sagged sideways and crumpled onto the floor, blood spilling from his ruined face. "How's that for ya?" laughed the Bloody Nine, wiping blood out of his eyes and giving the Stone Splitter's lifeless body a couple of kicks. The room spun around him, swam around him, laughing. "How's that? Fuck." He stumbled, blinked, sleepy, campfire guttering. No, not yet. He dropped to his knees. Not yet. There was more to do. Always more. Not yet, he snarled, but his time was up. Logan screamed. He fell down. Pain everywhere. His legs, his shoulder, his head. He wailed until the blood caught in his throat, then he coughed and gasped and rolled around, scrabbling at the floor. The world was a blurry smear. He gurgled up blood and drooled it out long enough to start wailing again. A hand clamped over his mouth. "Stop your damn crying, Pink! Now you hear me?" A voice whispering urgent in his ear. Strange, hard voice. "Stop your crying, or I leave you, understand? One chance." The hand came away. Air came out between his gritted teeth in a high-pitched, keening moan, but not too loud. A hand clamped round his wrist, dragged his arm up. He gasped as his shoulder, stretched out, was dragged over something hard. Torture. "Up, bastard! I can't carry you! Up now! One chance, understand?" He was lifted slowly. He tried to push with his legs. The breath whistled and clicked in his throat, but he could do it. Left foot, right foot. Easy. His knee buckled. Pain stabbed up his leg. He screamed again and fell, grovelled on the floor. Best to lie still. His eyes closed. Something slapped him hard in the face. And again. He grunted. Something slid under his armpit, started to pull him up. "Up, Pink! Up, or I leave you! One chance, you hear?" Breath in, breath out. Left foot, right foot. Longfoot fussed and worried, first tapping his fingers on the arm of his chair, then counting on them, shaking his head and moaning about tides. Giselle stayed silent, hoping against hope that the two savages might have drowned in the moat, and that the whole venture might therefore come to nothing. There would still be plenty of time to make it to Angland. Perhaps all was not lost. He heard the door open behind him, and his dreams were punctured. Misery swaddled him once again, but it was soon replaced by horrified surprise as he turned around. Two ragged shapes stood in the doorway, covered in blood and filth. Devils, surely, stepped out from some gate to hell. The Gurkish woman was cursing as she lurched into the room. Nine Fingers had one arm across her shoulders, the other swinging loose, blood dripping from his fingertips, head drooping. They wobbled together for a step or two, then the Northman's stumbling foot caught on a chair leg, and they tumbled onto the floor. The woman snarled and shrugged off his limp arm, shoved him away, and scrambled up to her feet. Nine Fingers rolled over slowly, groaning, and a deep gash in his shoulder yawned open, oozing blood across the carpet. It was red in there, like fresh meat in a butcher's shop. Giselle swallowed, horrified and fascinated at once. "God's breath! They came for us." "What? Who came?" A woman sidled cautiously around the doorframe, red-haired, all in black, wearing a mask. A practical, Giselle's numb brain was saying, but he could not understand why she was so bruised or walking with such a limp. Another edged through behind her, a man armed with a heavy sword. "You're coming with us," said the woman. "Make me," Malgin spat at her. Giselle was shocked to see she had produced a knife from somewhere, and a bloody one at that. She should not be armed, not here. He realized, stupidly, that he was wearing a sword. Of course he was. He fumbled with the hilt and drew it, with the vague intention of knocking the Gurkish devil on the back of the head with the flat before she could do any more damage. If the Inquisition wanted her, they could damn well have her, and the rest of them too. Unfortunately, the practicals got the wrong idea. "Stop it!" hissed the red-haired woman, glaring at him through narrow eyes. "I will not," said Giselle, tremendously offended that she might think he was on the side of these villains. Said Quai. Groaned Nine Fingers, clutching up a bloody handful of carpet and dragging it towards him, making the table lurch across the floor. A third practical crept through the door around the red-haired woman, a heavy mace in his gloved fist. An unpleasant-looking weapon. Giselle could not help picturing the effect it might have on his skull if swung in anger. He fingered the hilt of his sword uncertainly, feeling in terrible need of someone to tell him what to do. "Coming with us," said the woman again, as her two friends advanced slowly into the room. "Oh dear," murmured Longfoot, taking cover behind the table. Then the door to the bathroom banged against the wall. Baez stood there, entirely naked, dripping with soapy water. His slow gaze took in first Pharaoh, scowling with her knife out, then Longfoot hiding behind the table, Giselle with sword drawn, Quai standing with his mouth open, Nine Fingers sprawled out in a bloody ruin, and finally the three black-masked figures, weapons at the ready. There was a pregnant pause. "What the fuck is this?" he roared, striding into the center of the room, water dripping from his beard, down through the grizzled white hairs on his chest, off his slapping fruits. It was a strange sight to see. A naked old man confronting three armed practicals of the Inquisition. Ridiculous, and yet no one was laughing. There was something strangely terrifying about him, even without his clothes and running with wet. It was the practicals who shifted backwards, confused, scared even. "You're coming with us," the woman repeated, though a certain doubt seemed to have entered her voice. One of her companions stepped warily toward Baez. Giselle felt a strange sensation in his stomach, a tugging, a sucking, an empty, sick feeling. It was like being back on the bridge in the shadow of the Maker's house, only worse. The wizard's face had turned terribly hard. "My patience is at an end." Like a bottle dropped from a great height, the nearest practical burst apart. There was no thunderclap, only a gentle squelching. One moment he was moving toward the old man, sword raised, entirely whole. The next he was 1,000 fragments. Some unknown part of him thudded wetly against the plaster next to Giselle's head. His sword dropped and rattled on the boards. "You were saying?" growled the first of the Magi. Giselle's knees trembled, his mouth gaped. He felt faint and queasy and awfully hollow inside. There were spots of blood across his face, but he dared not move to wipe them off. He stared at the naked old man, unable to believe his eyes. It seemed that he had watched a well-meaning old buffoon change in an instant into a brutal murderer, and without the slightest grain of hesitation. The red-haired woman stood there a moment, spattered with blood and flecks of meat and bone, eyes wide as two dinner plates, then started to shuffle slowly backwards towards the door. The other one followed her, almost tripping over Nine Fingers' foot in his haste to get away. Everyone else stayed motionless as statues. Giselle heard quick footsteps in the corridor outside as the two practicals ran for their lives. He almost envied them. They, it seemed, would escape. He was trapped in this nightmare. "We must leave now!" barked Baez, wincing as if he was in pain. "Just as soon as I have my trousers on. Help him, Longfoot!" he shouted over his shoulder. For once, the navigator was lost for words. He blinked, then got up from behind the table and bent down over the unconscious Northman, ripped off a strip of his tattered shirt to use as a bandage. He paused, frowning, as though unsure where to begin. Giselle swallowed. His sword was still in his hand, but he seemed to lack the strength to put it away. Bits of the unfortunate practical were scattered around the room, stuck to the walls, the ceiling, the people. Giselle had never seen a man die before. let alone in so hideous and unnatural a fashion. He supposed he should have been horrified, but instead he felt only an overpowering sense of relief. His worries seemed now rather petty things. He, at least, was still alive. Chapter 45. The Tools We Have. Glocta stood in the narrow hallway, leaning on his cane and waiting. On the other side of the door, he could hear raised voices. "I said no visitors." He sighed to himself. He had many better things to do than to stand around here on his aching leg, but he had given his word, and he meant to keep it. A poky, unremarkable hallway in a poky, unremarkable house among many hundreds of others the same. The whole district was recently built, terraces of houses in the new fashion, half-timbered, 3 stories, good perhaps for a family and a couple of servants. Hundreds of houses, one very much like another. Houses for the gentlefolk, the new rich. Jumped-up commoners, Salt would probably have called them. Bankers, merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, clerks. Perhaps the odd townhouse of some successful gentleman farmer, like this one here. The voices had stopped now. Glocta heard movement, some clinking of glass, then the door opened a crack and the maid peered out. An ill-favoured girl with big watery eyes. She looked scared and guilty. Still, I am used to that. Everyone seems scared and guilty around the Inquisition. "She'll see you now," the girl mumbled. Glocta nodded and shuffled past her into the room beyond. He had some hazy memories of staying with West's family for a week or two one summer up in Angland, a dozen years ago perhaps, although it seemed more like 100. He remembered fencing with West in the courtyard of their house, of being watched every day by a dark-haired girl with a serious face. He remembered meeting a young woman in the park not long ago who had asked him how he was. He had been in a lot of pain at the time, scarcely seeing straight, and her face was a blur in his memory. So it was that Glocta was not sure what to expect. But he certainly had not expected the bruises. He was a touch shocked for a moment, though I hide it well. Dark purple and brown and yellow under her left eye, the lower lid well swollen. Round the corner of her mouth, too, the lip split and scabbed over. Glocta knew a lot about bruises, few men more. And I hardly think she got these by accident. She was punched in the face by someone who meant it. He looked at those ugly marks, and he thought about his old friend Colum West, crying in his dining room and begging for help, and he put the two together. Interesting. She sat there all the while, looking back at him with her chin high, the side of her face with the worst bruises turned towards him, as though challenging him to say something. She is not much like to her brother, not much like at all. I don't think she'll be bursting into tears in my dining room, or anywhere else. "What can I do for you, Inquisitor?" she asked him coldly. He detected the very slightest slurring of the word Inquisitor. She has been drinking, though she hides it well. Not enough to make her stupid. Glocta pursed his lips. For some reason he had the feeling that he needed to watch his step. "I'm not here in a professional capacity. Your brother asked me to—" She cut him off rudely. "Did he? Really? Here to make sure I don't fuck the wrong man, are you?" Glocta waited for a moment, allowing that to sink in. Then he began to chuckle softly to himself. "Oh, that's grand. I begin to quite like her." "Something funny?" she snapped. "Pardon me," said Glocta, wiping his running eye with a finger. But I spent 2 years in the Emperor's prisons. I dare say if I had known I'd be there half that long at the start, I would have made a more concerted effort to kill myself. 700 days, give or take, in the darkness. As close to hell, I would have thought, as a living man can go. My point is this. If you mean to upset me, you'll need more than harsh language. Glocta treated her to his most revolting, toothless, crazy smile. There were few people indeed who could stomach that for long, but she did not look away for an instant. Soon, in fact, she was smiling back at him, a lopsided grin of her own, and one which he found oddly disarming. A different tack, perhaps. The fact is, your brother asked me to look after your welfare while he is away. As far as I'm concerned, you can fuck whomever you please, though my general observation has been that, as far as the reputations of young women are concerned, the less fucking, the better. The reverse is true for young men, of course. Hardly fair, but then life is unfair in so many ways. This one hardly seems worth commenting on. You're right there. Good, said Glocta. So, we understand each other then. I see that you hurt your face. She shrugged. I fell. I'm a clumsy fool. I know how you feel. I'm such a fool. I knocked half my teeth out and hacked my leg to useless pulp. Look at me now, a cripple. It's amazing where a little foolishness can take you if it goes unchecked. We clumsy types should stick together, don't you think? She looked at him thoughtfully for a moment, stroking the bruises on her jaw. Yes, she said. I suppose we should. Goyle's practical Vitari was sprawled on a chair opposite Glocta, just outside the huge dark doors to the Archlector's office. She was slumped into it, poured onto it, draped over it like a wet cloth, long limbs dangling, head resting on the back. Her eyes twitched lazily around the room from time to time under heavy lids, sometimes coming to rest on Glocta himself for insultingly long periods. She never turned her head, though, or indeed moved a muscle, as though the effort might be too painful. Which, indeed, it probably would be. Plainly, she had been involved in a most violent melee, hand to hand. Above her black collar, her neck was a mass of mottled bruises. There were more around her black mask, a lot more, and a long cut across her forehead. One of her drooping hands was heavily bandaged. The knuckles of the other were scratched and scabbed over. She's taken more than a couple of knocks, fighting hard against someone who meant business. The tiny bell jumped and tinkled. "Inquisitor Glocta," said the secretary as he hurried out from behind his desk to open the door. "His Eminence will see you now." Glocta sighed, grunted, and heaved on his cane as he got to his feet. "Good luck," said the woman as he limped past. "What?" She gave a barely perceptible nod towards the Archlector's office. "He's in a hell of a mood today." As the door opened, Salt's voice washed out into the anteroom, changing from a muffled murmuring into an all-out scream. The secretary jerked back from the gap as if slapped in the face.
20 practicals!
Shrieked the Archlector from beyond the archway.
20! We should have been questioning that bitch now instead of sitting here licking our wounds. How many practicals?
20, Archlector.
20, damn it!
Glocta took a deep breath and insinuated himself through the door.
And how many dead?
The Archlector was striding briskly up and down the tiled floor of his huge circular office, waving his long arms in the air. He was dressed all in white, as spotless as ever. Though I fancy a hair is out of place, maybe even 2. He must truly be in a fury.
How many?
7, mumbled Superior Goyle, hunched into his chair.
A third of them! A third! How many injured?
8.
Most of the rest! Against how many?
In all, there was 6.
Really?
The Archlector thumped his fists on the table, leaning down over the shrinking Superior.
I heard 2! 2!
He screamed, pacing once more round and round the table.
And both of them savages! 2 I heard! A white one and a black one, and the black one a woman! A woman!
He kicked savagely at the chair next to Goyle, and it wobbled back and forth on its feet.
And what's worse, there were countless witnesses to this disgrace. Did I not say discreet? What part of the word discreet is beyond your comprehension, Goyle?
But, Archlector, circumstances cannot...
Cannot?
Salt Screech rose an entire octave higher.
Cannot? How dare you give me cannot, Goyle? Discreet I asked for, and you gave me bloody slaughter across half the Agriont, and failed into the bargain. We look like fools. Far worse, we look like weak fools. My enemies on the closed council will waste no time in turning this farce to their advantage. Moravia's already stirring trouble, the old windbag, whining about liberty and tighter reins and all the rest of it. Damn lawyers! They had their way, we'd get nothing done. And you're making it happen, Goyle. I'm stalling, and I'm saying sorry, and I'm trying to put things in the best light, but a turd's a turd, whatever light it's in. Do you have any notion of the damage you've inflicted? Of the months of hard work you've undone?
But, Archlector, have they not now left the...
They'll be back, you cretin! He did not go to all this trouble simply to leave, dolt. Yes, they've gone, idiot, and they've taken the answers with them. Who they are, what they want, who is behind them. Left? Left? Damn you, Goyle!
I am wretched, Your Eminence.
You are less than wretched.
I cannot but apologize.
You're lucky you're not apologizing over a slow fire.
Salt sneered his disgust.
Now, get out of my sight.
Goyle flashed a look of the most profound hatred at Glockter as he cringed his way out of the room. Goodbye, Superior Goyle, goodbye. The Archlector's fury could not fall upon a more deserving candidate. Glockter could not suppress the tiniest of smiles as he watched him go.
Something amusing you?
Salt's voice was ice as he held out his white-gloved hand, purple stone flashing on his finger. Glockter bent to kiss it. Of course not, Your Eminence.
Good, because you've nothing to be amused about, I can tell you. Keys?
He sneered.
Stories? Scrolls? What could have possessed me to listen to your drivel?
I know, Archlector. I apologize. Glockter edged humbly into the chair that Goyle had so recently vacated.
You apologize, do you? Everyone apologizes. Some good that does me. Fewer apologies and more successes is what I need. And to think I had such high hopes for you. Still, I suppose we must work with the tools we have.
Meaning? But Glockter said nothing.
We have problems. Very serious problems in the south.
The south, Archlector?
Togoska. The situation there is grave. Gurkish troops are flocking to the peninsula. They already outnumber our garrison by 10 to 1, and all our strength is committed in the north. 3 regiments of the King's Own remain in Adua, but with the peasants getting out of hand across half of Midderland, they cannot be spared. Superior de Voost was keeping me informed in weekly letters. He was my eyes, Glockter. Do you understand? He suspected that there was a conspiracy afoot within the city. A conspiracy intending to deliver Dagoska into the hands of the Gurkish. 3 weeks ago, the letters stopped, and yesterday I learned that de Voost has disappeared. Disappeared! A superior of the Inquisition. Vanished into thin air. I am blind, Glockter. I am fumbling in the dark at a most crucial time. I need someone there that I can trust. Do you understand?
Glockter's heart was thumping. Me?
Oh, you're learning, sneered Salt. You are the new superior of Dagoska.
Me?
Many congratulations, but forgive me if we leave the feast until a quieter moment. You, Glocta! You!
The Archlector leaned down over him.
Go to Dagoska and dig. Find out what happened to Davoost. Weed the garden down there. Root out everything disloyal. Everything and anyone. Light a fire under them. I need to know what's going on, if you have to toast the Lord Governor until he drips gravy.
Glocta swallowed. Toast the Lord Governor?
Is there an echo in here?
Snarled Salt, looming even lower.
Sniff out the rot and cut it away. Hack it off. Burn it out. All of it, wherever it is. Take charge of the city's defences yourself if you must. You were a soldier.
He reached out and slid a single sheet of parchment across the tabletop.
This is the King's writ, signed by all 12 chairs on the closed council. All 12. I sweated blood to get it. Within the city of Dagoska, you will have full powers.
Glocta stared down at the document. A simple sheet of cream-coloured paper, black writing, a huge red seal at the bottom. We, the undersigned, confer upon His Majesty's faithful servant, Superior Sandan Glocta, our full powers and authority. Several blocks of neat writing, and below 2 columns of names. Crabby blotches, flowing swirls, near illegible scrawls. Hoth, Salt, Barovia, Baruz, Halleck, Burr, Torlicorn, and all the rest. Powerful names. Glocta felt faint as he picked up the document in his 2 trembling hands. It seemed heavy.
Don't let it go to your head. You still have to tread carefully. We can stand no more embarrassments. But the Gurkish must be kept out at all costs, at least until this business in Angland is settled. At all costs. Do you understand?
I understand. A posting to a city surrounded by enemies and riddled with traitors, where one superior has already mysteriously disappeared. Closer to a knife in the back than a promotion, but we must work with the tools we have. I understand, Archlector.
Good. Keep me well informed. I want to be swamped by your letters.
Of course.
You have 2 practicals, correct?
Yes, Your Eminence. Frost and Severard, both very...
Not nearly enough. You won't be able to trust anyone down there, not even the Inquisition.
Salt seemed to think about that for a moment.
Especially the Inquisition. I have picked out a half-dozen others whose skills are proven, including practical Vitari.
That woman watching over my shoulder? But, Archlector...
Don't butt me, Glocta, hissed Salt. Don't you dare butt me, not today. You're not half as crippled as you could be. Not half as crippled, you understand?
Glocta bowed his head. I apologize.
You're thinking, aren't you? I can see the cogs turning, thinking you don't want one of Goyle's people getting in the way. Well, before she worked for him, she worked for me, a Styrian from Sipano. Cold as the snow, those people, and she's the coldest of them, I can tell you. So you needn't worry, not about Goyle, anyway.
No, only about you, which is far worse. I will be honored to have her along. I will be damned careful.
Be as honored as you damn well please. Just don't let me down. Make a mess of this, and you'll need more than that piece of paper to save you. A ship is waiting at the docks. Leave, now.
Of course, Your Eminence. Salt turned away and strode over to the window. Glocta quietly got up, quietly slid his chair under the table, quietly shuffled across the room. The Archlector was still standing, hands clasped behind him as Glocta ever so carefully pulled the doors to. It was not until they clicked shut that he realized he had been holding his breath. "How'd they go?" Glocta turned round sharply, his neck giving a painful click. Strange how I never learn not to do that. Practical Vitari was still flopped in her chair, looking up at him with tired eyes. She did not seem to have moved the whole time he was inside. How did it go? He ran his tongue around his mouth, over his empty gums, thinking about it. That remains to be seen. "Interesting," he said in the end. "I am going to Dugostka." "So I hear." The woman did indeed have an accent, now he thought about it. A slight whiff of the free cities. "I understand you're coming with me." "I understand I am." But she did not move. "We are in something of a hurry." "I know." She held out her hand. "Could you help me up?" Glocta raised his eyebrows. I wonder when I was last asked that question. He had half a mind to say no, but in the end he held his hand out, if only for the novelty. Her fingers closed round it, started to pull. Her eyes were narrowed. He could hear her breath hissing as she unfolded herself slowly from the chair. It hurt, having her pull on him like that, in his arm, in his back. But it hurts her more. Behind her mask, he was pretty sure her teeth were gritted with pain. She moved her limbs one at a time, cautiously, not sure what would hurt and how much. Glocta had to smile. A routine I go through myself every morning. Strangely invigorating to see someone else doing it. Eventually she was standing, her bandaged hand clutched against her ribs. "You able to walk?" asked Glocta. "I'll loosen up." What happened? Dogs? She gave a bark of laughter. "No! A big Northman knocked the shit out of me." Glocta snorted. Well, forthright at least. "Shall we go?" She looked down at his cane. "Don't suppose you got one of those spare, have you?" "I'm afraid not. I only have the one, and I can't walk without it." "I know how you feel." "Not quite." Glocta turned and began to limp away from the Archlector's office. Not quite. He could hear the woman hobbling along behind. Strangely invigorating to have someone trying to keep up with me. He upped the pace, and it hurt him. But it hurts her more. Back to the south, then. He licked at his empty gums. Hardly a place of happy memories. To fight the Gurkish, after what it cost me last time. To root out disloyalty in a city where no one can be trusted, especially those sent to help me. To struggle in the heat of the dust at a thankless task almost certain to end in failure. And failure, more than likely, will mean death. He felt his cheek twitch, his eyelid flicker. At the hands of the Gurkish? At the hands of plotters against the crown? At the hands of His Eminence or his agents? Or simply to vanish, as my predecessor did? Has one man ever had such a range of deaths to choose from? The corner of his mouth twitched up. I can hardly wait to get started. That same question came into his head over and over, and he still had no answer. Why do I do this? Why?